Question 1. Operational review demonstrates a pattern of unusual trading activity by a specific employee in their personal investment account, coinciding with the release of material non-public information by companies where the employee's spouse holds a senior executive position. The compliance officer is tasked with investigating this potential insider trading risk. Which of the following actions best represents a prudent and compliant initial response? Option A. Advise the employee that their trading activity is under scrutiny due to potential conflicts of interest and request an explanation. Option B. Initiate a discreet review of the employee's trading records and communications, cross-referencing them with the timing of relevant corporate announcements and the spouse's company activities, while maintaining strict confidentiality. Option C. Archive the operational review findings, deeming the potential conflict too sensitive to investigate further without concrete proof of wrongdoing. Option D. Immediately escalate the findings to senior management and the relevant regulatory authority, requesting an investigation into potential insider trading. The correct answer is B. Initiate a discreet review of the employee's trading records and communications, cross-referencing them with the timing of relevant corporate announcements and the spouse's company activities, while maintaining strict confidentiality. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge in balancing client confidentiality with the firm's obligation to maintain robust internal controls and prevent potential market abuse. The operational review has identified a potential weakness, and the compliance officer must act decisively without prematurely accusing individuals or breaching privacy unnecessarily. The professional challenge lies in gathering sufficient, objective information to confirm or refute the suspicion, while adhering to strict data privacy regulations and internal policies. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and evidence-based investigation. This aligns with best professional practice by prioritizing due diligence and a fair process. It respects individual privacy by not immediately escalating to disciplinary action or external reporting without a factual basis. The regulatory and ethical justification stems from the principle of innocent until proven guilty and the need for verifiable evidence before taking punitive measures. This approach also upholds the firm's commitment to regulatory compliance by proactively addressing potential breaches of market abuse regulations. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately reporting the suspicion to senior management and potentially the regulator without conducting a preliminary investigation. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it bypasses the firm's internal investigation protocols, potentially leading to an unfounded accusation, reputational damage for the individual, and an unnecessary burden on regulatory resources. It violates the principle of procedural fairness. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the findings of the operational review due to the sensitive nature of the data and the potential for employee backlash. This represents a significant ethical and regulatory failure. It demonstrates a dereliction of duty in upholding the firm's compliance obligations and a disregard for preventing market abuse. This inaction could expose the firm to severe penalties if a breach subsequently occurs and is discovered. A third incorrect approach is to directly confront the employee with the suspicion without any corroborating evidence. This is professionally unsound and ethically problematic. It can lead to a defensive reaction, destroy trust within the team, and potentially tip off the individual if misconduct is indeed occurring, allowing them to conceal further evidence. It also fails to adhere to a structured, evidence-gathering process mandated by good governance and compliance frameworks. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should adopt a structured decision-making process. First, acknowledge the identified risk and its potential implications. Second, consult relevant internal policies and regulatory guidelines pertaining to investigations, data privacy, and market abuse. Third, plan a discreet and thorough investigation, focusing on objective data collection and analysis. Fourth, document all steps taken and findings meticulously. Fifth, consult with legal and compliance departments as appropriate throughout the process. Finally, base any subsequent actions on confirmed facts and established procedures, ensuring fairness and regulatory adherence. Question 2. Consider a scenario where a client, who has a moderate risk tolerance, instructs their financial advisor to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative, unproven asset class that has recently experienced a surge in value. The advisor has concerns that this investment is not aligned with the client's stated risk profile and may not be suitable for their long-term financial goals, despite the client's insistence that they want to capitalize on the current market trend. Option A. Inform the client that while the investment is speculative, you will proceed as instructed, but suggest they sign a waiver acknowledging the high risk and potential for loss, thereby shifting the responsibility solely to them. Option B. Refuse to discuss the investment further and suggest the client seek advice from another advisor who is more willing to accommodate their specific investment preferences. Option C. Execute the client's instruction immediately to maintain a good client relationship, assuming the client is fully aware of the risks involved and has the ultimate authority over their investments. Option D. Advise the client against the investment, clearly explaining the risks and the misalignment with their risk tolerance and long-term goals, and propose alternative investments that better fit their profile while still offering growth potential. Document all discussions and the client's final decision. The correct answer is D. Advise the client against the investment, clearly explaining the risks and the misalignment with their risk tolerance and long-term goals, and propose alternative investments that better fit their profile while still offering growth potential. Document all discussions and the client's final decision. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's explicit instructions and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when those instructions might lead to suboptimal outcomes or regulatory breaches. The advisor must navigate the complexities of client autonomy versus professional responsibility, ensuring compliance with all relevant regulations while maintaining a strong client relationship. The challenge lies in delivering advice that is both legally sound and ethically aligned with the client's long-term financial well-being. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing the client's best interests and adhering strictly to regulatory requirements. It involves clearly communicating the risks and potential negative consequences of the client's requested action, providing alternative, more suitable recommendations, and documenting all discussions and decisions thoroughly. This aligns with the principles of acting with integrity, skill, care, diligence, as mandated by the Aeon hiring assessment test's regulatory framework, which emphasizes a client-centric approach and adherence to compliance procedures. The advisor's responsibility is to educate and guide the client, not merely to execute instructions that could be detrimental. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that blindly follows the client's instructions without further inquiry or advice fails to uphold the advisor's fiduciary duty. This constitutes a regulatory failure by not acting in the client's best interest and potentially exposing the client to undue risk or noncompliance. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of professional responsibility. An approach that dismisses the client's request outright without attempting to understand the underlying rationale or offering alternatives is unprofessional and can damage the client relationship. While it might avoid immediate regulatory breach from executing a poor instruction, it fails to provide comprehensive advice and support, potentially leading to client dissatisfaction and a missed opportunity to guide the client towards a better solution. An approach that attempts to circumvent regulations to fulfill the client's request, even with the client's consent, is a severe regulatory and ethical failure. This demonstrates a lack of integrity and a disregard for the established legal and compliance framework, which is paramount in the financial services industry. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process. First, fully understand the client's request and the rationale behind it. Second, assess the request against regulatory requirements and the advisor's professional obligations, particularly the duty to act in the client's best interest. Third, identify any potential conflicts or risks. Fourth, communicate these findings clearly and comprehensively to the client, explaining the implications of their request and offering well-reasoned alternatives. Fifth, document all advice and client decisions meticulously. If a client insists on a course of action that is deemed unsuitable or non-compliant, the professional must be prepared to decline the instruction and, if necessary, terminate the relationship, always acting within the bounds of regulatory and ethical guidelines. Question 3. The investigation demonstrates that a senior executive at a key client firm has made several offhand remarks to a trusted contact within your firm, suggesting they possess non-public information about an upcoming significant merger. The contact, a junior analyst, has reported these remarks to you, the compliance officer, with concern. The client firm is a major source of revenue for your organization. What is the most appropriate course of action for the compliance officer? Option A. Initiate a discreet internal investigation to gather more information and assess the credibility of the remarks before considering any external reporting. Option B. Immediately report the executive's remarks to the relevant regulatory authority, citing potential insider trading. Option C. Dismiss the remarks as casual conversation, given the client's importance and the junior analyst's limited experience, and take no further action. Option D. Advise the trusted contact to subtly warn the client executive that their remarks have been overheard and could attract regulatory attention. The correct answer is A. Initiate a discreet internal investigation to gather more information and assess the credibility of the remarks before considering any external reporting. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the obligation to report potential market abuse. Firm's compliance officer must navigate the delicate balance of protecting client information while upholding regulatory integrity and preventing harm to the market. This requires a nuanced understanding of the relevant regulatory framework and a commitment to ethical conduct. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, objective, and documented internal investigation before escalating to external regulators. This aligns with the principles of due diligence and responsible corporate behavior expected under the Aeon hiring assessment tests regulatory framework. By gathering all available facts and assessing the situation internally, the firm can determine if a genuine breach has occurred, thereby avoiding unnecessary reporting and potential reputational damage to the client and the firm. This methodical approach ensures that any subsequent reporting is well-founded and actionable, fulfilling the firm's regulatory obligations without overstepping boundaries. An incorrect approach that involves immediately reporting the suspicion to the regulator without any internal investigation would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This premature action could lead to unfounded accusations, damage the client's reputation, and strain the relationship between the firm and its clients. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and an abdication of the firm's responsibility to conduct its own initial assessment. Furthermore, it could be seen as a breach of client confidentiality if the suspicion is ultimately unfounded. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the information due to the client's importance, represents a severe ethical and regulatory failure. This would constitute a dereliction of duty, as the firm would be knowingly failing to address potential market abuse. This inaction could expose the firm to significant penalties and sanctions, and more importantly, allow market abuse to continue, harming market integrity. It directly contravenes the regulatory obligation to report suspicious activities. A third incorrect approach, which is to subtly warn the client about potential regulatory scrutiny without explicitly stating the suspicion, is also professionally unacceptable. This is an attempt to circumvent direct reporting obligations while still attempting to manage the situation. It is ethically dubious as it could be interpreted as tipping off a client about an investigation, which is a serious offense. It also fails to address the core regulatory requirement to report suspected market abuse. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process when faced with such situations. This involves 1. Identifying the potential regulatory or ethical issue. 2. Consulting the relevant regulatory framework and internal policies. 3. Gathering all relevant facts and evidence objectively. 4. Assessing the situation based on the gathered information and regulatory requirements. 5. Determining the appropriate course of action, which may include internal investigation, consultation with legal counsel, or reporting to regulators. 6. Documenting all steps taken and decisions made. Question 4. Upon reviewing a client's investment portfolio and discussing their upcoming financial goals, the client expresses a strong desire to invest a significant portion of their funds into a product that you know is subject to strict disclosure requirements and has a history of misrepresentation by some distributors, even though the product itself is not inherently illegal. The client is insistent on proceeding immediately, stating they have received insider tips about its imminent surge in value. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Immediately refuse the investment and inform the client that their request is inappropriate and potentially illegal. Option B. Explain to the client the specific regulatory concerns and disclosure requirements associated with the product, and explore alternative compliant investment strategies that align with their goals. Option C. Advise the client to seek independent legal counsel before proceeding with the investment, without offering any further guidance. Option D. Proceed with the investment as requested, but ensure all standard documentation is signed, assuming the client is fully aware of the risks. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the investment as requested, but ensure all standard documentation is signed, assuming the client is fully aware of the risks. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the potential for those wishes to lead to regulatory breaches or unethical conduct. The advisor must navigate this by prioritizing regulatory compliance and ethical obligations over immediate client satisfaction, even when the client is insistent. Careful judgment is required to identify the point at which a client's request crosses the line into noncompliance or unethical behavior. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it upholds the advisor's fiduciary duty and commitment to regulatory frameworks. By seeking clarification and explaining the regulatory limitations, the advisor demonstrates integrity and a commitment to operating within the bounds of the law and ethical guidelines. This proactive communication prevents potential future issues and reinforces the advisor's role as a trusted, compliant professional. It aligns with the principles of acting in the client's best interest, which includes protecting them from regulatory penalties and reputational damage. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the client's request without further inquiry would be a direct violation of regulatory obligations. This could lead to sanctions, fines, and damage to the firm's reputation. It demonstrates a failure to exercise due diligence and a disregard for the established rules governing financial advice. Another incorrect approach, such as dismissing the client's request outright without explanation, might be perceived as unhelpful or dismissive, potentially damaging the client relationship. While it avoids regulatory breach, it fails to educate the client or explore alternative, compliant solutions, which is a key aspect of professional advisory services. A further incorrect approach, such as attempting to find a loophole or a technically compliant but ethically questionable method, undermines the spirit of the regulations and could still expose both the client and the advisor to significant risk. It suggests a lack of commitment to genuine compliance and ethical conduct. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve 1. Understanding the client's objective. 2. Identifying any potential conflicts with regulatory requirements or ethical standards. 3. Seeking clarification from the client to ensure full understanding of their intent. 4. Clearly communicating any identified regulatory or ethical concerns, explaining the specific rules or principles involved. 5. Proposing compliant and ethical alternative solutions that still aim to meet the client's underlying needs. 6. Documenting all discussions and decisions thoroughly. Question 5. Market research demonstrates a growing demand for financial services from emerging market businesses. A potential new client, a rapidly expanding technology startup from a jurisdiction with a less robust regulatory framework, has expressed strong interest in opening a significant account. The client has provided basic identification documents, but is hesitant to disclose detailed information about the source of their initial capital and the specific nature of their international transactions, citing competitive sensitivity. The firm's business development team is eager to onboard this client due to the potential for substantial future revenue. What is the most appropriate course of action for the firm to take in this situation? Balancing business opportunity with regulatory obligations. Option A. Request the client to provide a general overview of their business activities and source of funds, and proceed with onboarding if the overview appears satisfactory, without independent verification of specific details. Option B. Proceed with onboarding the client after obtaining a written assurance from their legal counsel regarding compliance with all relevant anti-money laundering regulations. Option C. Decline to onboard the client if they are unwilling to provide complete and verifiable information regarding the source of funds and the nature of their international transactions, as required by the firm's Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) policies. Option D. Onboard the client but implement enhanced monitoring of their account transactions for the first 6 months, without requiring further upfront due diligence. The correct answer is B. Proceed with onboarding the client after obtaining a written assurance from their legal counsel regarding compliance with all relevant anti-money laundering regulations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's desire to expand its client base and the stringent regulatory obligations to conduct thorough due diligence. The pressure to onboard new clients quickly, especially in a competitive market, can lead to shortcuts that compromise regulatory compliance. Professionals must exercise sound judgment to balance business objectives with their fiduciary duties and legal responsibilities. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes adherence to the established Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) procedures. This aligns with the core principles of regulatory compliance, which mandate that financial institutions understand their clients and the nature of their business to prevent financial crime. By conducting the full due diligence, including verifying the source of funds and understanding the client's business activities, the firm upholds its legal and ethical obligations, mitigates reputational risk, and contributes to the integrity of the financial system. This proactive stance is a cornerstone of responsible financial conduct. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with onboarding without completing the full due diligence, relying solely on the client's assurances. This directly violates regulatory requirements for customer due diligence, specifically regarding the verification of identity and the assessment of risk. It exposes the firm to significant legal penalties, reputational damage, and the potential facilitation of illicit activities. Another incorrect approach is to delegate the entire due diligence process to the client, asking them to provide all necessary documentation without independent verification by the firm. This abdication of responsibility is a clear breach of regulatory mandates. Financial institutions are legally obligated to perform their own due diligence, not to rely on self-certification without robust checks. This approach creates a significant blind spot for the firm, making it vulnerable to fraudulent information and noncompliance. A further incorrect approach might be to implement a light-touch due diligence process for this specific client, deeming them low risk based on superficial information. Regulatory frameworks often require a risk-based approach, but this does not permit arbitrary or unsubstantiated risk assessments. If the initial information suggests potential red flags, or if the client's business model is complex, a more thorough investigation is warranted. Failing to escalate or conduct deeper scrutiny based on initial indicators is a failure to apply the risk-based approach effectively and can lead to regulatory breaches. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of applicable regulations, such as those pertaining to KYC and AML. When faced with a situation where business objectives might conflict with compliance, the first step is to consult the firm's internal policies and procedures, which should be designed to reflect regulatory requirements. If there is any ambiguity, or if the situation presents a potential deviation from standard procedures, seeking guidance from the compliance department or legal counsel is paramount. The decision should always err on the side of caution, prioritizing regulatory adherence and ethical conduct over immediate business gains. This involves a systematic assessment of risks, thorough documentation of decisions, and a commitment to continuous learning about evolving regulatory landscapes. Question 6. Examination of the data shows a long-standing, high-net-worth client has recently engaged in a series of complex international transactions involving multiple jurisdictions and shell corporations, with no clear commercial rationale readily apparent to the relationship manager. The client has been evasive when asked for details about the purpose of these transactions. What is the most appropriate course of action for the firm? Option A. Immediately file a suspicious activity report (SAR) with the relevant financial intelligence unit based on the unusual nature of the transactions and the client's evasiveness. Option B. Inform the client that their transactions are being flagged as suspicious and ask them to provide a detailed explanation in writing without further internal consultation. Option C. Ignore the transactions, given the client's importance to the firm's revenue and the potential for losing their business if the matter is pursued further. Option D. Conduct a thorough internal investigation, gathering all available documentation, consulting with the firm's compliance department and legal counsel to assess the situation against regulatory thresholds for reporting, and documenting all findings and decisions. The correct answer is A. Immediately file a suspicious activity report, SAR, with the relevant financial intelligence unit based on the unusual nature of the transactions and the client's evasiveness. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the obligation to report potential regulatory breaches. The firm's duty to its client to maintain discretion must be balanced against its responsibilities under the relevant regulatory framework, which mandates reporting of suspicious activities to prevent financial crime. The challenge lies in discerning when a client's actions cross the threshold from legitimate, albeit unusual, activity to something that warrants disclosure to the authorities, without prematurely or incorrectly implicating the client. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, documented internal investigation before escalating to external reporting. This aligns with regulatory expectations that firms conduct due diligence and internal reviews to gather sufficient evidence to support a suspicion. By consulting with the compliance department and legal counsel, the firm demonstrates adherence to internal policies and regulatory guidelines concerning suspicious activity reporting, SAR. This process ensures that any report made is well-founded, minimizing the risk of unfounded accusations against the client and upholding the firm's integrity. It also allows for the possibility that the client's actions, upon further investigation, are found to be legitimate. An incorrect approach that involves immediate reporting without internal investigation fails to meet the standard of reasonable suspicion. Regulators expect firms to exercise professional judgment and conduct a preliminary assessment. Reporting based on incomplete information could lead to unnecessary scrutiny of the client, damage the client relationship, and potentially result in reputational harm to the firm if the suspicion proves unfounded. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the activity due to the client's importance or the potential loss of business, represents a severe regulatory and ethical failure. This constitutes a deliberate disregard for anti-money laundering (AML) and counter-terrorist financing (CTF) obligations. Such inaction can have significant legal consequences for the firm and its individuals, including substantial fines and reputational damage, and it undermines the integrity of the financial system. A further incorrect approach, which is to passively ask the client for an explanation without documenting the interaction or the client's response, is insufficient. While seeking clarification is part of due diligence, it must be conducted in a structured and documented manner. Without proper record keeping, the firm cannot demonstrate to regulators that it took appropriate steps to investigate the suspicious activity. This lack of documentation can be interpreted as a failure to comply with record-keeping requirements and a lack of diligence in managing risk. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment. First, identify the potentially suspicious activity and its context. Second, consult internal policies and procedures for handling such situations. Third, gather all relevant information and documentation. Fourth, engage with the compliance department and legal counsel to assess the situation against regulatory thresholds for reporting. Fifth, document all steps taken, discussions, and decisions. Finally, act in accordance with regulatory obligations and professional judgment, prioritizing integrity and compliance. Question 7. Performance analysis shows a long-standing and profitable client has recently engaged in a series of transactions that, while not explicitly illegal on their face, exhibit patterns strongly suggestive of market manipulation. Your firm's compliance department has flagged these transactions, but the client has indicated that any formal inquiry or reporting would lead to them immediately withdrawing their substantial business. What is the most appropriate course of action for a compliance officer in this situation? Option A. Discreetly advise the client on how to modify their trading strategies to appear less suspicious, without formally reporting the initial concerns internally or to regulators. Option B. Immediately escalate the concerns through the firm's internal reporting channels to the compliance department and senior management, and prepare for potential regulatory reporting if internal review confirms the suspicion, regardless of the client's business value. Option C. Continue with the client's business as usual, assuming the transactions are legitimate until definitive proof of illegal activity is established, to avoid jeopardizing the firm's revenue. Option D. Inform the client that their recent trading activity is under review and suggest they cease the questionable practices, but refrain from any further internal escalation or external reporting unless the client fails to comply. The correct answer is B. Immediately escalate the concerns through the firm's internal reporting channels to the compliance department and senior management, and prepare for potential regulatory reporting if internal review confirms the suspicion, regardless of the client's business value. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's desire to retain a valuable client and the regulatory obligation to act in the best interests of clients and the integrity of the financial markets. The pressure to overlook potential misconduct for commercial gain requires a strong ethical compass and a clear understanding of regulatory boundaries. The challenge lies in balancing client relationships with the paramount duty of compliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach, which involves escalating the matter internally and potentially reporting it to the relevant regulatory body, represents best professional practice because it prioritizes regulatory compliance and client protection above commercial interests. This aligns with the fundamental principles of conduct expected of financial professionals, such as integrity, due diligence, and acting in the best interests of clients. Specifically, it adheres to the spirit and letter of regulations that mandate reporting of suspicious activities and maintaining market integrity. This proactive stance prevents potential harm to clients and the broader market, and it safeguards the firm from future regulatory sanctions and reputational damage. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach, which is to ignore the red flags and continue with the client's business as usual, represents a severe regulatory and ethical failure. This demonstrates a disregard for the firm's compliance obligations and a failure to act with integrity. It exposes the firm and its employees to significant regulatory penalties, including fines and disciplinary actions, and could lead to the client suffering financial losses due to the underlying misconduct. Ethically, it is a betrayal of the trust placed in the firm by its clients and the market. Another incorrect approach, which is to subtly advise the client to adjust their practices without explicitly reporting the concerns, is also professionally unacceptable. While it might seem like a way to maintain the client relationship, it falls short of the required regulatory action. This approach can be seen as an attempt to circumvent direct reporting obligations, potentially masking the true extent of the issue. It fails to ensure that the misconduct is properly addressed and could still leave the client exposed to regulatory scrutiny or financial harm if the adjustments are insufficient. It also risks the firm being seen as complicit if the misconduct is later discovered. A third incorrect approach, which is to inform the client that their activities are being reviewed and suggest they cease the questionable practices, but without any formal internal escalation or reporting, is also problematic. While it shows some awareness, it lacks the robust procedural safeguards required by regulatory frameworks. The firm has a duty to investigate thoroughly and report findings through established channels, not just to rely on the client's self-correction. This approach may not be sufficient to meet the firm's obligations to report suspicious activities or to protect other potential victims. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should first and foremost consult their firm's internal compliance policies and procedures. This typically involves reporting the concerns to the compliance department or a designated supervisor. The decision-making process should be guided by a commitment to upholding regulatory standards and ethical principles. This involves a thorough assessment of the potential risks to clients in the market and a clear understanding of the firm's reporting obligations. When in doubt, seeking guidance from the compliance department or legal counsel is crucial. The ultimate goal is to ensure that all actions taken are in full compliance with the law and ethical best practices, even if it means potentially losing a client. Question 8. Strategic planning requires a financial advisor to balance a firm's internal policy regarding investment suitability with their fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of each client. If a client's specific circumstances present a potential conflict with the firm's standard policy, what is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor to take? Option A. Assess the client's situation against the firm's policy. Seek clarification from the compliance department on potential exceptions or alternative compliance solutions, and document the rationale for any deviation or adherence. Option B. Implement a solution that best serves the client's interests by bypassing the firm's policy, assuming the client's explicit consent is sufficient. Option C. Inform the client that the firm's policy cannot accommodate their specific needs and advise them to seek services elsewhere if the policy cannot be met. Option D. Strictly apply the firm's policy to the client's situation, regardless of whether it fully aligns with the client's best interests, to ensure adherence to internal guidelines. Correct answer is A. Assess the client's situation against the firm's policy, seek clarification from the compliance department on potential exceptions or alternative compliance solutions, and document the rationale for any deviation or adherence. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where a financial advisor must navigate conflicting client interests and regulatory obligations. The firm's internal policy, while seemingly designed to protect clients, could inadvertently lead to a breach of fiduciary duty if applied rigidly without considering individual client circumstances. The advisor must balance the firm's directive with their personal responsibility to act in the best interest of each client, a core tenet of regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This requires careful judgment to determine when an exception is warranted and how to document such decisions appropriately. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a nuanced understanding of regulatory requirements and ethical duties. It prioritizes a client-centric assessment, recognizing that a blanket policy may not always serve the client's best interest. By seeking clarification and proposing a tailored solution that still adheres to the spirit of the policy while addressing the client's specific needs, the advisor demonstrates a commitment to both regulatory compliance and fiduciary responsibility. This proactive communication and problem-solving approach ensures that client interests are paramount, aligning with the principles of good conduct expected by regulatory bodies. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves strictly adhering to the firm's policy without considering the client's unique situation. This fails to uphold the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, potentially leading to regulatory sanctions for failing to provide suitable advice or for placing the firm's policy above client needs. It also ignores the ethical imperative to provide personalized service. Another incorrect approach is to bypass the firm's policy entirely and implement a solution without proper authorization or documentation. This creates significant compliance risks for both the advisor and the firm, as it demonstrates a disregard for internal controls and established procedures. It could be viewed as an attempt to circumvent regulatory oversight and may lead to disciplinary action. A third incorrect approach is to simply inform the client that the firm's policy cannot be accommodated without exploring alternatives. This is a failure of professional responsibility and customer service. It does not demonstrate an effort to find a compliant solution that meets the client's needs, potentially damaging the client relationship and reflecting poorly on the firm's commitment to client satisfaction. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such dilemmas should employ a structured decision-making process. First, thoroughly understand the client's needs and objectives. Second, review relevant internal policies and external regulations. Third, identify any conflicts or potential conflicts between these. Fourth, explore all possible compliance solutions, considering the spirit and intent of policies and regulations. Fifth, consult with compliance or legal departments when uncertainty exists. Finally, document all decisions and the rationale behind them meticulously. This systematic approach ensures that client interests are protected, regulatory obligations are met, and the firm's reputation is maintained. Question 9. Analysis of a scenario where a client, who has a moderate risk tolerance and a short-term investment horizon, explicitly requests to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative, illiquid asset class that is not typically recommended for such profiles. The firm's compliance department has flagged this asset class as carrying substantial regulatory scrutiny due to its volatility and potential for misrepresentation. The firm is regulated under UK financial services law. Option A. Proceed with the client's requested investment after obtaining a signed disclaimer from the client acknowledging the risks, while also documenting the firm's concerns internally. Option B. Conduct a full suitability assessment to determine if the requested investment aligns with the client's stated risk tolerance and investment objectives, and if not, explain the regulatory and suitability concerns to the client and propose alternative compliance strategies. Option C. Inform the client that the firm cannot facilitate this investment due to internal policy without further explanation or offering alternatives. Option D. Immediately execute the client's requested investment as per their instructions, as the client is ultimately responsible for their investment decisions. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the client's requested investment after obtaining a signed disclaimer from the client acknowledging the risks, while also documenting the firm's concerns internally. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's explicit instructions and the firm's regulatory obligations. The firm must navigate the client's desire for a specific investment strategy with the paramount duty to ensure that strategy is suitable and compliant with all applicable regulations. The challenge lies in balancing client relationships with fiduciary responsibilities and regulatory adherence. Careful judgment is required to avoid both regulatory breaches and client dissatisfaction. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes regulatory compliance and client best interests above all else. By conducting a thorough suitability assessment, the firm demonstrates adherence to its fiduciary duty and regulatory requirements, such as those mandated by the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, in the UK, which emphasizes treating customers fairly and ensuring that financial promotions and advice are clear, fair, and not misleading. This proactive approach mitigates risks for both the client and the firm, ensuring that any investment recommendation aligns with the client's financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance. This aligns with the principles of conduct expected of regulated firms. An incorrect approach that proceeds with the client's instruction without a suitability assessment fails to uphold the firm's regulatory obligations. This would likely breach FCA principles for businesses, specifically Principle 2, Due Diligence and Care, and Principle 6, Customers' Interests. Ethically, it is a failure of fiduciary duty, as the firm is not acting in the client's best interests, but rather facilitating a potentially unsuitable transaction. Another incorrect approach, which involves simply refusing the client's request without explanation or offering alternatives, is also professionally unacceptable. While it avoids a direct regulatory breach related to suitability, it demonstrates poor client relationship management and a lack of proactive problem solving. This could lead to client attrition and damage the firm's reputation. Ethically, it falls short of the expected standard of service and client care. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the client's request and underlying objectives. 2. Identify all relevant regulatory requirements and internal policies. 3. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of the client's circumstances, including financial capacity, investment objectives, and risk tolerance. 4. Evaluate the suitability of the requested strategy against the client's profile and regulatory standards. 5. If the requested strategy is unsuitable or non-compliant, clearly communicate the reasons to the client, referencing regulatory principles and the firm's duty of care. 6. Propose alternative strategies that are both suitable for the client and compliant with regulations. 7. Document all communications, assessments, and decisions thoroughly. Question 10. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a significant volume of candidate data has been ingested for the Aeon hiring assessment test, but preliminary checks suggest potential inconsistencies in the formatting and completeness of certain fields. Which of the following actions best upholds regulatory compliance and professional integrity in this situation? Option A. Perform a quick, superficial check for obvious errors and proceed with the analysis to ensure timely delivery of results. Option B. Delegate the entire data validation process to an intern without specific oversight, trusting their diligence. Option C. Conduct a thorough validation of the ingested data against predefined quality standards and regulatory requirements before proceeding with any analysis or reporting. Option D. Proceed with the analysis using the data as is, assuming the initial data entry was accurate, to meet the urgent reporting deadline. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough validation of the ingested data against predefined quality standards and regulatory requirements before proceeding with any analysis or reporting. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the need for efficient data processing with the stringent requirements of regulatory compliance, specifically concerning data privacy and integrity. The pressure to deliver timely insights can lead to shortcuts that compromise these fundamental obligations. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the pursuit of efficiency does not inadvertently lead to breaches of regulatory frameworks. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic review and validation of the data against established regulatory standards before its use in any analysis. This aligns with the principles of data governance and regulatory compliance, which mandate that data used for reporting or decision-making must be accurate, complete, and handled in accordance with applicable laws and guidelines. This proactive validation minimizes the risk of generating misleading insights or violating data protection regulations, thereby upholding professional integrity and adherence to the Aeon hiring assessment test's specific regulatory framework. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the analysis using the data as is, assuming the initial data entry was accurate. This fails to acknowledge the inherent possibility of errors or inconsistencies in data collection and processing. Ethically and regulatorily, this is unacceptable as it risks producing flawed outcomes and potentially violating data integrity requirements. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the foundational principles of reliable data handling. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize speed of analysis over data quality, by only performing a superficial check for obvious errors. While seemingly efficient, this approach still leaves room for subtle but significant data inaccuracies that could lead to incorrect conclusions. This falls short of the robust data validation expected under regulatory scrutiny, as it does not guarantee the reliability of the data used for assessment purposes. A third incorrect approach is to delegate the entire data validation process to a junior team member without adequate oversight or clear guidelines. While delegation can be a tool for efficiency, abdication of responsibility for ensuring regulatory compliance is a serious failure. The ultimate accountability for the integrity of the data and the compliance of the analysis rests with the professional, not solely with the delegate. This approach risks overlooking critical validation steps and demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should adopt a risk-based approach to data validation. This involves understanding the potential impact of data inaccuracies on the assessment outcomes and regulatory compliance. A structured process should be in place, including clear data validation protocols, regular audits, and escalation procedures for identified issues. The decision-making process should prioritize adherence to regulatory requirements and ethical standards, even if it means a slight delay in analysis, to ensure the integrity and reliability of the assessment process. Question 11. The audit findings indicate that the firm's current risk assessment methodology primarily relies on analyzing past incidents and known threats, with limited consideration for emerging geopolitical instability and evolving technological advancements that could impact client portfolios. Which of the following approaches best addresses this identified weakness in the firm's risk assessment framework? Option A. Focus the risk assessment solely on the firm's core financial products, assuming that diversification will naturally mitigate external threats. Option B. Reduce the resources allocated to risk assessment to streamline the process and improve efficiency. Option C. Increase the frequency of internal audits to identify and rectify any immediate operational failures stemming from current risks. Option D. Implement a scenario analysis framework that incorporates forward-looking assumptions about geopolitical events and technological disruptions, and assess their potential impact on the firm's risk profile. The correct answer is D. Implement a scenario analysis framework that incorporates forward-looking assumptions about geopolitical events and technological disruptions, and assess their potential impact on the firm's risk profile. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential gap in the firm's risk assessment process, specifically concerning the identification and evaluation of emerging risks. This scenario is professionally challenging because risk assessment is not a static exercise. It requires continuous adaptation to a dynamic financial landscape. The firm must demonstrate a robust framework that anticipates, rather than merely reacts to, potential threats. The correct approach involves a proactive and forward-looking methodology that integrates qualitative and quantitative analysis to assess the likelihood and impact of identified risks. This aligns with regulatory expectations for firms to maintain effective risk management systems, ensuring that potential vulnerabilities are understood and mitigated before they materialize. Such an approach fosters a culture of vigilance and preparedness, which is a cornerstone of sound financial stewardship and regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach that relies solely on historical data without considering future trends or external factors fails to meet the forward-looking requirements of effective risk management. This can lead to a false sense of security and leave the firm exposed to unforeseen events, potentially breaching regulatory obligations to manage risks prudently. Another incorrect approach that focuses only on operational risks while neglecting strategic or reputational risks presents an incomplete picture. This narrow focus can result in significant blind spots where critical threats to the firm's viability are overlooked, leading to potential regulatory sanctions and reputational damage. Finally, an approach that prioritizes cost-saving over thoroughness in risk assessment undermines the fundamental purpose of the exercise. Regulatory frameworks emphasize the importance of adequate resources and expertise dedicated to risk management, and cutting corners in this area is a direct contravention of these principles. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the firm's strategic objectives and operating environment. This understanding then informs the identification of potential risks, both internal and external. Subsequently, these risks must be evaluated based on their potential impact and likelihood, using a combination of analytical tools and expert judgment. The output of this assessment should directly inform the development and implementation of appropriate risk mitigation strategies and controls. Regular review and updating of the risk assessment process are crucial to ensure its continued relevance and effectiveness. Question 12. Research into the potential impact of a new, disruptive technology on the firm's long-term viability has identified several possible scenarios. One scenario suggests a significant, albeit uncertain, threat to the firm's core business model within 5 years. The firm's current risk assessment framework primarily relies on historical data and quantitative metrics to evaluate risk likelihood and impact. Which approach to assessing this emerging risk best aligns with robust risk management principles and regulatory expectations for proactive risk identification. Option A. Conduct a qualitative assessment of the emerging technology's potential impact and likelihood, incorporating expert judgment and scenario planning to understand the range of possible outcomes and develop adaptive mitigation strategies. Option B. Rely solely on the firm's historical performance data to predict the likelihood and impact of the new technology, assuming past trends will continue. Option C. Exclude this risk from formal assessment as it cannot be quantified with historical data, focusing instead on risks with readily available quantitative metrics. Option D. Prioritize the assessment and mitigation of other, more immediate risks that have clear historical data and quantifiable impacts, deferring a detailed assessment of this technology until its impact becomes more certain. The correct answer is A. Conduct a qualitative assessment of the emerging technology's potential impact and likelihood, incorporating expert judgment and scenario planning to understand the range of possible outcomes, and develop adaptive mitigation strategies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent subjectivity in assessing the likelihood and impact of emerging risks, particularly those that are novel or poorly understood. The firm must balance the need for proactive risk management with the practical limitations of data availability and predictive modeling for such risks. Careful judgment is required to avoid both overreaction and complacency. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it emphasizes a structured, evidence-informed, and forward-looking methodology. It acknowledges the limitations of current data for novel risks and advocates for a qualitative assessment informed by expert judgment and scenario planning. This aligns with regulatory expectations that firms should have robust risk management frameworks capable of identifying and responding to a broad spectrum of risks, including those not yet fully materialized. Specifically, it reflects the principles of proactive risk identification and the need for adaptive strategies, as often underscored in guidance from bodies like the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, in the UK, which expects firms to consider the full spectrum of potential risks to their business model and clients. An incorrect approach that relies solely on historical data for novel risks is professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge that past performance is not indicative of future results, especially for emerging threats. It represents a failure to comply with the spirit, if not the letter, of regulatory requirements that mandate forward-looking risk assessments and the consideration of unknown unknowns. Such an approach could lead to significant underestimation of potential impact and likelihood, leaving the firm vulnerable. Another incorrect approach that focuses exclusively on quantifiable risks, ignoring qualitative indicators or expert opinion, is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the nature of many emerging risks, which may not have readily available quantitative metrics, and lead to a narrow and incomplete risk profile, neglecting significant threats that are difficult to measure but could have severe consequences. This contravenes the principle of comprehensive risk assessment, which requires considering all relevant factors, whether quantifiable or not. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate, easily mitigated risks over potentially more impactful but less certain emerging risks is professionally unacceptable. This reflects a short-term perspective and a failure to implement a strategic risk management approach. While addressing immediate threats is important, neglecting emerging risks can lead to systemic vulnerabilities that are far more damaging in the long run. This demonstrates a lack of foresight and a failure to meet the regulatory expectation of maintaining the resilience of the firm and protecting consumers. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Risk identification, employing a broad range of techniques including horizon scanning, expert interviews, scenario analysis, and industry trend monitoring to identify potential emerging risks. 2. Risk assessment. For each identified risk, qualitatively assess its potential impact and likelihood, using expert judgment where quantitative data is scarce. Consider a range of potential outcomes. 3. Risk prioritization. Rank risks based on their potential severity and likelihood, considering both immediate and long-term implications. 4. Risk mitigation and response. Develop appropriate strategies to mitigate, transfer, accept, or avoid identified risks. For emerging risks, focus on building resilience and developing contingency plans. 5. Monitoring and review. Continuously monitor the risk landscape and review the effectiveness of risk management strategies, adapting them as new information becomes available. Question 13. System analysis indicates that a financial advisor at Aeon has observed a client consistently structuring cash deposits into multiple accounts across different branches, with the stated purpose of avoiding administrative thresholds for reporting. The advisor has also noted that the client's stated business activities do not appear to generate the volume of cash being deposited. The advisor is aware of the firm's anti-money laundering policies and the regulatory obligations under the UK's financial crime framework. Which of the following actions best represents the professional and regulatory best practice in this situation? Option A. Continue to monitor the client's activity without taking further action, as the client has provided an explanation for the deposits. Option B. Immediately report the suspicion to the relevant law enforcement agency, detailing the observed transactions and the client's explanation. Option C. Inform the client directly that their deposit structuring activities are raising concerns and could be interpreted as suspicious. Option D. Escalate the matter internally to the firm's Money Laundering Reporting Officer, MLRO, for assessment and guidance. The correct answer is B. Immediately report the suspicion to the relevant law enforcement agency, detailing the observed transactions and the client's explanation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the regulatory obligation to report suspicious activities. The firm is entrusted with sensitive client information, creating a duty of care and loyalty. However, the Aeon Hiring Assessment Test's regulatory framework mandates proactive identification and reporting of potential financial crime. Navigating this requires a nuanced understanding of when a suspicion crosses the threshold from mere observation to a reportable event, balancing client trust with legal compliance. The pressure to maintain client relationships must not override statutory duties. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves escalating the matter internally to the firm's designated compliance officer, or MLRO, Money Laundering Reporting Officer. This aligns with best professional practice and regulatory requirements under the Aeon framework. The MLRO is specifically trained and empowered to assess suspicious activity reports, SAR. This internal escalation ensures that the suspicion is evaluated by an expert who can determine if it meets the legal threshold for reporting to the relevant authorities, such as the National Crime Agency, NCA, in the UK. This process protects the client's confidentiality by preventing unauthorized disclosure while fulfilling the firm's statutory duty to report. It also ensures that the reporting is done correctly and in accordance with the specific requirements of the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, (POCA), and the Terrorism Act 2000, which underpin the UK's anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing regime. Incorrect approach is analysis. Directly reporting the suspicion to the authorities without internal consultation is a regulatory failure. This bypasses the established internal reporting procedures, potentially leading to premature or unfounded reports that could damage the client's reputation and the firm's relationship with them. It also fails to leverage the expertise of the MLRO, who is best placed to make the initial assessment. Furthermore, it could be construed as a breach of client confidentiality if the report is not properly substantiated and authorized. Ignoring the suspicion and taking no action is a severe regulatory and ethical failure. This directly contravenes the firm's obligations under POCA and the Terrorism Act 2000, which require reporting of knowledge or suspicion of money laundering or terrorist financing. Failure to report can result in significant penalties for both the individual and the firm, including fines and imprisonment. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for the firm's role in combating financial crime. Confronting the client directly about the suspicion is also a significant regulatory and ethical misstep. This action, known as tipping off, is explicitly prohibited under Section 333A of the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002. Tipping off a suspect that a report has been or is to be made to the authorities can prejudice investigations and is a criminal offense. It undermines the integrity of the reporting system and can allow criminals to conceal or dissipate illicit funds. Professional reasoning. Professionals must adopt a structured decision-making process when faced with potential suspicious activity. This involves 1. Recognizing potential red flags based on training and knowledge of the firm's policies and regulatory obligations. 2. Documenting observations and the basis for suspicion clearly and factually. 3. Escalating the matter immediately to the designated compliance officer or MLRO, providing all relevant details. 4. Cooperating fully with the internal investigation and following the MLRO guidance. 5. Maintaining strict confidentiality throughout the process, adhering to the tipping off provisions. This systematic approach ensures compliance, protects the firm and its clients, and upholds the integrity of the financial system. Question 14. The efficiency study reveals that a new, automated trading platform could significantly reduce operational costs for the firm. However, this platform utilizes a different execution methodology that may result in slightly different price discretions for certain trade types compared to the current system. The firm is considering a swift implementation to realize cost savings, but the impact on individual client portfolios and the necessity of client notification are points of discussion. Which of the following represents the most professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Conduct a detailed analysis of the new platform's execution methodology and its potential impact on various client portfolio types. Engage with clients to explain the proposed changes and their implications, and ensure the new system aligns with client suitability profiles before full implementation. Option B. Implement the new trading platform immediately to capture cost efficiencies, assuming the price discretions are within acceptable market variations and will ultimately benefit clients through lower overall service costs. Option C. Roll out the new platform to a select group of clients who are known to be less sensitive to minor price variations, while continuing to use the old system for other clients until further analysis can be completed. Option D. Proceed with the implementation of the new platform without informing clients, as the changes are internal operational adjustments aimed at improving efficiency, and clients will benefit indirectly from the firm's enhanced profitability. The correct answer is B. Implement the new trading platform immediately to capture cost efficiencies, assuming the price discretions are within acceptable market variations and will ultimately benefit clients through lower overall service costs. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the pursuit of operational efficiency with the fundamental duty to act in the client's best interest and adhere to regulatory standards concerning client suitability and disclosure. The pressure to implement a new, potentially more cost-effective trading system without fully assessing its impact on client portfolios or informing clients of material changes creates a conflict between business objectives and fiduciary responsibilities. Careful judgment is required to ensure that efficiency gains do not come at the expense of client outcomes or regulatory compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes client welfare and regulatory adherence. By conducting a thorough impact assessment, engaging with clients to explain the changes and their implications, and ensuring the new system aligns with client suitability profiles, the firm upholds its fiduciary duty. This proactive communication and due diligence demonstrate transparency and a commitment to client centricity, which are cornerstones of ethical financial conduct and regulatory expectations. Specifically, this aligns with principles of client care and suitability, ensuring that any changes to service delivery do not negatively impact the client's investment objectives or risk tolerance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the cost savings of the new system without considering client impact fails to uphold the duty of care and suitability. This could lead to clients being exposed to unintended risks or suboptimal investment outcomes, potentially violating regulatory requirements that mandate acting in the client's best interest. Another incorrect approach that involves implementing the system without any client notification or explanation is a clear breach of transparency and disclosure obligations. Clients have a right to be informed of material changes that could affect their investments, and withholding such information erodes trust and can lead to regulatory sanctions. A third incorrect approach that assumes all clients will benefit equally from the new system, without individual assessment, ignores the diverse needs and circumstances of the client base, again, contravening suitability requirements. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential conflicts between business goals and client interests or regulatory obligations. This should be followed by a comprehensive assessment of the impact of any proposed change on clients, considering suitability, risk, and potential benefits. Open and transparent communication with clients about material changes is paramount. Finally, ensuring that all actions are in full compliance with the relevant regulatory framework, including rules on suitability, disclosure, and client best interests, should guide the ultimate decision. Question 15. Which approach would be most appropriate for a financial advisor who has identified a pattern of complex, high-value transactions from a client that appear to lack clear economic or business purpose, and where the client has been evasive when questioned about the source of funds? Option A. Conduct a thorough internal review of the client's transaction history and documentation. Consult the firm's anti-money laundering policies, and if reasonable grounds for suspicion persist, report the activity to the National Crime Agency. Option B. Immediately cease all business with the client and terminate the relationship without further investigation or reporting. Option C. Discuss the specific concerns about the transactions and source of funds directly with the client to seek clarification before taking any further action. Option D. Ignore the unusual transaction patterns to avoid jeopardizing the valuable client relationship and potential future business. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough internal review of the client's transaction history and documentation. Consult the firm's anti-money laundering policies, and if reasonable grounds for suspicion persist, report the activity to the National Crime Agency. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the regulatory obligation to report suspicious activities. The challenge lies in balancing the duty of loyalty to the client with the broader responsibility to maintain market integrity and prevent financial crime. A professional must exercise sound judgment to identify when a client's actions cross the line from legitimate business to potential illicit activity, requiring careful consideration of available information and the specific thresholds for reporting. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the regulatory framework governing financial crime prevention. Specifically, it involves a thorough internal review and escalation process that aligns with the principles of the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, POCA, and the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, handbook. This approach ensures that potential money laundering or terrorist financing is investigated internally before any external reporting, thereby respecting client confidentiality as much as possible while fulfilling the statutory duty to report suspicious activity to the National Crime Agency, NCA, when reasonable grounds for suspicion exist. This demonstrates a commitment to both client relationships and regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach that involves ignoring the client's unusual transaction patterns due to a desire to avoid disrupting the business relationship, would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This directly contravenes the spirit and letter of POCA, which mandates reporting of suspicious activity regardless of the client relationship. It also breaches FCA principles, such as Principle 11, Relations with Regulators, which requires firms to be open and cooperative with the FCA. Furthermore, failing to report could facilitate financial crime, undermining market integrity. Another incorrect approach, which is to immediately report the suspicion to the NCA without any internal investigation or gathering of further information, is also professionally problematic. While it fulfills the reporting obligation, it may be premature and could unnecessarily damage the client relationship and the firm's reputation if the suspicion is unfounded. Best practice dictates a proportionate response, involving internal due diligence to confirm or refute suspicions before escalating. This demonstrates a lack of nuanced judgment and potentially an inefficient use of regulatory resources. Finally, an approach that involves discussing the suspicion with the client directly before reporting would be a severe breach of confidentiality and potentially tip off the client, which is a criminal offense under POCA. This would not only compromise any potential investigation, but also expose the firm to significant regulatory sanctions and legal repercussions. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, identify potential red flags based on established anti-money laundering (AML) and counter-terrorist financing (CTF) typologies. Second, gather and review all available information related to the suspicious activity, applying enhanced due diligence if necessary. Third, consult internal policies and procedures, and if necessary, seek advice from the firm's compliance or MLRO, money laundering reporting officer. Fourth, if reasonable grounds for suspicion persist after internal review, proceed with reporting to the NCA through the appropriate channels. Throughout this process, maintaining detailed records of all actions taken and decisions made is crucial. Question 16. The review process indicates that a new investment product, designed to offer enhanced diversification benefits to retail clients, has been developed. However, the product's structure involves a novel derivative component that is not explicitly addressed in the firm's current product governance policies or risk assessment frameworks, which were last updated prior to the introduction of recent regulatory guidance on complex products. The product development team is eager to launch the product to meet market demand, but the compliance department has raised concerns about potential gaps in the existing policy's applicability. What is the most appropriate course of action for the firm to ensure regulatory compliance and responsible product launch? Option A. Delay the launch indefinitely until the firm can undertake a complete overhaul of all product governance policies to encompass all conceivable future product innovations. Option B. Implement a set of highly restrictive controls, mirroring those for the firm's most complex and highest-risk products, to ensure absolute compliance, even if it significantly impacts the product's commercial viability. Option C. Proceed with the launch immediately, assuming that the general principles of existing product governance policies adequately cover the risks associated with this new product. Option D. Conduct a bespoke risk assessment and policy review specifically for this new product, engaging compliance and legal teams to identify any necessary amendments or new controls before proceeding with the launch. Correct answer is D. Conduct a bespoke risk assessment and policy review specifically for this new product, engaging compliance and legal teams to identify any necessary amendments or new controls before proceeding with the launch. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge where a firm's internal policies, designed to comply with regulatory requirements, clash with the practicalities of a new, innovative product launch. The challenge lies in balancing the need for robust risk management and regulatory adherence with the business imperative to bring a new offering to market efficiently. Overly rigid adherence to existing policies could stifle innovation, while a failure to adequately adapt policies could lead to regulatory breaches or unintended client harm. Careful judgment is required to ensure the new product is compliant without compromising its market viability. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a proactive and collaborative engagement with the compliance and legal department to conduct a thorough risk assessment and policy review specifically for the new product. This ensures that the product's design and implementation align with the spirit and letter of the relevant regulations, e.g., FCA Handbook, particularly COBS and CISC, and relevant CISI Code of Conduct principles. It demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing regulatory compliance and client protection from the outset. This approach allows for the identification of potential gaps in existing policies and the development of tailored controls or policy amendments, ensuring that the new product is launched in a compliant and responsible manner. It upholds the principles of treating customers fairly and maintaining market integrity. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with the launch without a formal policy review, assuming existing controls are sufficient. This represents a significant regulatory failure, as it bypasses the due diligence required to ensure compliance with specific product features and client interactions. It violates the principle of knowing your product and knowing your client, which are fundamental to regulatory frameworks like the FCA's. Ethically, it risks treating customers unfairly if the product's risks are not adequately disclosed or managed. Another incorrect approach is to delay the launch indefinitely due to minor policy ambiguities, without actively seeking clarification or proposing solutions. This can lead to a failure to meet business objectives and potentially disadvantage clients who could benefit from the product. While caution is important, an inability to adapt or find compliant solutions can be seen as a failure to act with due skill, care, and diligence, a core principle in professional conduct. It also fails to uphold the firm's responsibility to innovate responsibly within the regulatory perimeter. Third incorrect approach is to implement a one-size-fits-all solution that overburdens the new product with controls designed for high-risk activities, making it commercially unviable. While seemingly compliant, this approach fails to apply a risk-based approach, which is a cornerstone of effective regulation. It can lead to a misallocation of resources and a failure to deliver a competitive product, potentially impacting the firm's ability to serve its clients effectively. It may also be seen as a failure to act in the best interests of the firm and its clients by hindering innovation unnecessarily. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the regulatory landscape and the firm's internal policies. When faced with a new product or service, the first step is to identify all relevant regulatory obligations and internal control frameworks. This should be followed by a comprehensive risk assessment of the new offering, considering potential impacts on clients, market integrity, and the firm itself. Collaboration with compliance, legal, and risk management teams is crucial. If existing policies are insufficient or require adaptation, a formal process for policy review and amendment should be initiated, ensuring that any changes are documented, approved, and effectively communicated. The ultimate goal is to achieve compliance without stifling innovation, by applying a proportionate and risk-based approach. Question 17. The analysis reveals that a client who has explicitly stated their primary investment objective is capital preservation and has a low risk tolerance, expresses a strong interest in a specific investment product that is known for its high volatility and potential for significant capital loss. The client has some prior investment experience, but is not an expert in complex financial instruments. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor in this situation, adhering strictly to the regulatory framework governing financial advice? Option A. Recommend the higher risk product to the client, explaining its potential for higher returns, while acknowledging their stated objective but prioritizing their expressed interest. Option B. Proceed with recommending the high risk product, assuming the client understands the risks involved due to their prior investment experience, without further detailed explanation of the product's specific risks in relation to their stated objective. Option C. Explain to the client that the high-risk product is not suitable for their stated objective of capital preservation and low-risk tolerance, detailing the associated risks, and then propose alternative investments that align with their stated objectives. Option D. Decline to discuss the higher-risk product altogether, stating that it is completely unsuitable based on their stated objective and risk tolerance, and offer no alternatives. The correct answer is A. Recommend the high-risk product to the client, explaining its potential for higher returns, while acknowledging their stated objective but prioritizing their expressed interest. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in financial advisory where a client's stated investment objective, capital preservation, conflicts with their expressed desire for a specific higher-risk product. The professional must navigate this discrepancy while adhering to regulatory obligations, regarding suitability and client understanding. The challenge lies in balancing the client's expressed wishes with the advisor's duty to recommend investments that are appropriate for their stated risk tolerance and financial goals, as mandated by regulatory frameworks like the FCA's Conduct of Business Sourcebook. COBS. Misjudging this could lead to regulatory breaches and client harm. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes the client's stated objective of capital preservation and their overall risk profile over their specific product interest. This aligns with the regulatory requirement to ensure that any recommended investment is suitable for the client. COBS 9 specifically mandates that firms must take reasonable steps to ensure that a financial promotion is fair, clear, and not misleading, and that any recommendation is suitable for the client. This involves understanding the client's knowledge and experience, financial situation, and investment objectives. Recommending a product that contradicts the stated objective, even if the client expresses interest, would be a breach of suitability rules. The professional's duty is to educate the client about the risks associated with their desired product and explain why it is not suitable for their stated goal of capital preservation, offering alternatives that better align with that objective. Incorrect approach is analysis. Recommending the high-risk product solely because the client expressed interest, without adequately addressing the conflict with their stated capital preservation objective, constitutes a failure to meet suitability requirements. This approach prioritizes client demand over regulatory duty and client well-being, potentially exposing the client to unacceptable risk. It also fails to uphold the principle of acting in the client's best interests, a cornerstone of regulatory expectations. Proceeding with the higher-risk product without thoroughly explaining the risks and the mismatch with the client's stated objective is misleading. This breaches the requirement for clear and fair communication, as the client may not fully appreciate the implications of their choice. It also fails to provide appropriate advice, as the recommendation is not grounded in the client's stated financial goals. Refusing to discuss the high-risk product at all, even after understanding the client's interest, might be perceived as poor client service and a failure to explore all reasonable options. While the primary duty is suitability, a professional should aim to educate and guide the client, rather than outright dismiss their expressed interest without a thorough explanation of why it is not aligned with their stated objectives. However, this is less severe than recommending an unsuitable product. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the client's stated objectives, risk tolerance, financial situation, and knowledge and experience. When a conflict arises between stated objectives and expressed product interest, the professional must 1. Acknowledge the client's interest. 2. Clearly articulate the client's stated objective and risk profile. 3. Explain the characteristics and risks of the product of interest, highlighting how they diverge from the client's stated objective. 4. Discuss alternative products or strategies that are more aligned with the client's stated objective and risk profile. 5. Document the entire process, including the client's stated objectives, the discussion of risks, and the rationale for any recommendation or decision. This approach ensures compliance with regulatory requirements for suitability and fair treatment of customers, while also fostering trust and providing sound financial guidance. Question 18. Compliance review shows that a long-standing client who has consistently invested in low-risk, diversified portfolios has suddenly requested a significant transfer of funds to an offshore account with no clear stated purpose. The client has been evasive when asked for details about the intended use of these funds, only stating it is for a personal opportunity. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Seek further clarification from the client regarding the purpose of the transfer, review their investment profile for any changes, and consult with the firm's compliance department before proceeding. Option B. Decline to process the transfer and terminate the client relationship due to the suspicious nature of the request. Option C. Immediately report the client to the relevant financial intelligence unit for suspected money laundering activities. Option D. Proceed with the transfer as requested by the client, as they are an adult and have the right to direct their funds. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the transfer as requested by the client, as they are an adult and have the right to direct their funds. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves a conflict between a client's stated wishes and the potential for that client to be acting under undue influence or making a decision detrimental to their long-term well-being, which could have regulatory implications. The advisor must balance their duty of care and fiduciary responsibility with the client's autonomy. Careful judgment is required to discern whether the client's instructions are truly their own, or the result of external pressure, or a lack of capacity. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the client's best interests and adheres to regulatory obligations concerning client suitability and preventing financial crime. By seeking clarification and additional information, the advisor demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to understanding the true nature of the client's instructions. This aligns with principles of Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) regulations, which require firms to understand the source of funds and the purpose of transactions, especially when they appear unusual or potentially indicative of illicit activity. It also upholds ethical duties to act with integrity and in the client's best interest, which may supersede a direct instruction if that instruction is deemed harmful or suspicious. An incorrect approach that involves immediately executing the transaction without further inquiry fails to meet the advisor's duty of care and regulatory obligations. This could lead to facilitating financial crime or acting against the client's actual best interests if they are being coerced or are not fully aware of the implications. It bypasses crucial risk assessment steps. Another incorrect approach, that of reporting the client to authorities without attempting to understand the situation or clarify the client's intentions, could be premature and damage the client relationship unnecessarily. While reporting suspicious activity is a regulatory requirement, it should be based on a reasonable suspicion after due diligence, not an immediate assumption of wrongdoing. This approach might also violate client confidentiality principles if not handled appropriately. A further incorrect approach, that of refusing to engage with the client further and simply terminating the relationship, avoids the immediate problem but fails to address the underlying ethical and regulatory concerns. It also abandons the client, potentially leaving them vulnerable to the very risks the advisor identified. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify the potential conflict. Recognize when a client's instructions may be inconsistent with their known profile, risk tolerance, or regulatory requirements. 2. Gather information. Seek to understand the rationale behind the client's instructions through open-ended questions and by reviewing existing client data. 3. Assess risk. Evaluate the potential regulatory, ethical, and financial risks associated with fulfilling the instruction. 4. Consult internally. If uncertainty remains, escalate the situation to a supervisor or compliance department for guidance. 5. Act in the client's best interest. Make a decision that upholds regulatory obligations and prioritizes the client's long-term well-being, even if it means challenging their immediate request. 6. Document thoroughly. Maintain detailed records of all communications, assessments, and decisions made. Question 19. Strategic planning requires a financial advisor to balance a client's expressed preferences with their fiduciary duty. A long-term client, who has historically been risk-averse, now insists on investing a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative, emerging market sector, citing a recent news article. The advisor believes this strategy is not aligned with the client's stated risk tolerance and could jeopardize their retirement goals. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Thoroughly explain the risks and potential downsides of the speculative investment. Present alternative strategies that align better with the client's risk profile and long-term goals, and document the client's final decision after ensuring they understand all implications. Option B. Proceed with the client's requested investment as they are the ultimate decision maker, assuming they have considered the risks. Option C. Execute the investment as requested by the client, but avoid discussing the risks in detail to prevent alarming them. Option D. Strongly advise against the investment and refuse to execute it, insisting the client follow a more conservative approach that the advisor deems appropriate. The correct answer is A. Thoroughly explain the risks and potential downsides of the speculative investment. Present alternative strategies that align better with the client's risk profile and long-term goals, and document the client's final decision after ensuring they understand all implications. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated desires and the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, particularly when those desires could lead to suboptimal outcomes or regulatory breaches. The advisor must navigate the complexities of client autonomy versus professional responsibility, ensuring that advice is both compliant and truly beneficial. Careful judgment is required to balance these competing demands without compromising ethical standards or regulatory obligations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the client's long-term financial well-being and adheres strictly to the regulatory framework governing financial advice. By thoroughly explaining the risks and benefits of various strategies and documenting the client's informed decision-making process, the advisor upholds their fiduciary duty. This approach ensures transparency, client understanding, and compliance with regulations that mandate acting in the client's best interest and providing suitable advice. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on fulfilling the client's immediate, potentially ill-advised request without adequate exploration of alternatives or risk disclosure fails to meet the standard of care. This could lead to regulatory breaches related to suitability and client best interest obligations. Another incorrect approach, which involves pressuring the client into a specific strategy that the advisor deems best without fully respecting the client's ultimate decision-making authority, could be seen as overstepping professional boundaries and potentially violating principles of client autonomy and informed consent. A third incorrect approach, which involves avoiding the difficult conversation and proceeding with the client's request without proper due diligence or explanation, constitutes a failure in professional responsibility and regulatory compliance, as it bypasses the essential steps of risk assessment and informed consent. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's objectives and risk tolerance. This is followed by a comprehensive analysis of suitable strategies, clearly articulating the pros and cons of each, including potential regulatory implications. The advisor must then facilitate an informed decision by the client, ensuring they comprehend the advice and the consequences of their choices. Documentation of this process is crucial for accountability and demonstrating adherence to professional and regulatory standards. Question 20. During the evaluation of a client's investment portfolio, you discover discrepancies that strongly suggest the client may be engaging in insider trading. You have a long-standing relationship with this client, and they have been a significant source of business. However, your professional code of conduct and regulatory guidelines clearly outline the obligation to report suspected market abuse. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Discreetly advise the client on how to restructure their portfolio to avoid future scrutiny without reporting the current situation. Option B. Directly confront the client about your suspicions and ask them to explain the discrepancies without immediately reporting to authorities. Option C. Continue to manage the client's portfolio as usual, assuming the discrepancies are due to a misunderstanding or error on the client's part, and avoid raising the issue. Option D. Report the suspected insider trading to the relevant regulatory authorities, following the established internal procedures for such disclosures. The correct answer is D. Report the suspected insider trading to the relevant regulatory authorities, following the established internal procedures for such disclosures. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the obligation to report potential misconduct that could harm others. The core of the dilemma lies in balancing the duty of loyalty to a client with broader ethical and regulatory responsibilities. A professional must navigate this delicate balance, recognizing that while client trust is paramount, it does not extend to shielding illegal or harmful activities. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to regulatory frameworks and ethical codes that mandate reporting of serious concerns. Specifically, in the context of financial services, regulations often require professionals to report suspected fraud or market manipulation to prevent further harm to investors and maintain market integrity. This proactive reporting aligns with the principle of acting with integrity and in the best interests of the wider market and public, even when it may be personally difficult or disadvantageous to a client relationship. It upholds the professional's duty to be a responsible gatekeeper within the financial system. An incorrect approach that involves ignoring the information or downplaying its significance fails to acknowledge the potential for significant harm and the professional's duty to act. This could be a breach of regulatory obligations to report suspicious activity, potentially leading to disciplinary action, fines, and reputational damage. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of duty and a failure to uphold professional standards. Another incorrect approach, such as confronting the client directly without a clear plan or reporting mechanism, could tip off the client, allowing them to conceal or destroy evidence, thereby hindering any subsequent investigation. This approach also risks damaging the professional relationship without effectively addressing the underlying issue and could be seen as an inadequate response to a serious concern. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify the ethical and regulatory obligations at play. 2. Assess the severity and potential impact of the observed behavior. 3. Consult internal policies and procedures, and if necessary, seek guidance from compliance or legal departments. 4. Determine the appropriate reporting channels as mandated by regulations and professional codes. 5. Document all actions taken and decisions made meticulously. 6. Maintain confidentiality regarding the reporting process itself, as appropriate.